You open this door with the key of reason. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of truth. A dimension of freedom. A dimension of joy. You're moving into the land of both the ideal and the real, of the possible and the actual. You've just crossed over into the Capitalist Corner.
Where reason meets reality, welcome to the Capitalist Corner.
Welcome to the Capitalist Corner, everybody. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz, and joining us today is the wonderful James Valiant. Jim, welcome. Welcome back.
Always great to be here, my brother. Always great to be here. And happy Chinese Lunar New Year. It is the year of the horse as of today, and it commences a 2-week celebration in Chinese culture. So, my friends, enjoy the new year of the horse. It's a symbol for independence. So let's hope that this brings independence of thought to more people this year. I know that's total superstition, but there, I'll throw it out in any case.
Well, it's still great. Anything coming from you is great. Yes, I'm flattering you. I'm buttering you up.
Totally.
Everybody, I've got a great interview coming out this afternoon that I did with the lovely Persephone for the Rational Egoist. Please check that out. It's going to be wonderful. It'll be shared to Facebook, Twitter, and it'll be on Spotify and YouTube.
What a great idea. If you don't follow, everyday ethics, folks, you really are missing out on something really, really important. Your conversations with her are great. And of course, it's always great to hear you talk about ethics. But since you've included her as an integral part,
oh God,
no insult to you, but the quality of the conversation, the quality of the content has gone, much higher. Let me put it that way. She is a really smart person.
Awesome. Yeah. So as Jim said, check out the Rational Egoist, but also check out Everyday Ethics, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Great show. Robert Nasser puts JSV in the house. When I saw that, it reminds me of French. The JSV. So we got some good stuff to talk about today. So for starters, today is
President's Day.
President's Day, yes. I got to switch something here. I just noticed that things are a little off. Oh, no. Okay. President's Day, which was originally celebrated as Washington's birthday. I don't know why it's been switched, but it has. Oh, yes. I forgot, we have super chats and super stickers that we absolutely love. Are you following Barney V. Biddle? He's claimed elder abuse among the charges. Is there much doubt he got the idea from Kira? Is that good strategy? I haven't heard any of this. So I'm sorry, I like numbers, but I haven't the slightest idea of what
no clue what you're
talking about.
I'm pretty well informed on this, and I really don't know what that actually is getting at. I'd rather not talk about that right now.
Yeah, me neither. I got to be honest. Like, that stuff really does not interest me. I like when it was more for Jim, the question, but I'll put it this way. I am far more interested if there's philosophical disputes. I like those. Those interest me.
Well, I think there's philosophical dimensions to everything. And I think, some kind of legal dispute raises all kinds of moral and legal questions. And I think that we ought to attempt to apply our best philosophical reasoning to them. But look, if you don't know, and there's a lot going on, behind the surface. I mean, I will just say this: Kira is suing her father once more, and that tells you everything you need to know at this point. Draw whatever inferences you want from it, but let's not discuss it any further.
Yes. So, in preparation, we also later on will be discussing another topic, but in preparation for the discussion, I just want to discuss Washington's birthday. I think Washington, well, let me put it, I don't like federal holidays, period. I think that they ought to be done away with. I think if somebody wants to name a day that we can celebrate someone, I think that's fine. But when it gets into days off and then you got mandated overtime, all that stuff.
Legally mandated days off. That's a little, if the New York Stock Exchange and banks want to do it, and there ought not to be a post office. So this whole idea of government created, let's put it this way: I believe in a separation of state and calendar, just as I do a separation of state and economics, or state and education, or state and the list could go on. But Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th. I think Washington on February 22nd, something like that. And but we celebrated on a Monday to give people a long weekend holiday.
Yeah. Right.
So, there it is. I mean, I think that both of those men did great things. I think we ought to have maybe, a lot of days, like National Cherry Pie Day or whatever, National Donut Day or whatever, we don't celebrate those as holidays, but that could be near and dear to someone's heart. I have no problem designating a day as a day to remember something important. But when you legally mandate a holiday, which, sometimes this involves employers, and stuff like that, labor laws on the state level and stuff will recognize these things. I think that's absurd. What the hell is government doing dictating a calendar for everybody else? Of course, they have their own government calendar work days and they get to decide that. But apart from that, I have to agree with you. Now, I cherish July 4th because, of course, that is a significance for the independence of the United States and is connected to the, signing and adoption of the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the single most important political document ever penned in human history. I say that not just as an American, but in terms of what it did for liberalism, which will connect to what we're saying later.
Yeah.
But still, send off fireworks, have barbecues. If your private employer wants to give all of its, employees the day off for Christmas or the 4th of July, super. That's their private business, for their private business. But I'm opposed to labor laws. I'm opposed to mandated, shut down the whatever holidays. I mean, separation of state and calendar. Okay.
I'm not giving up anything for Lent, Robert, but thank you for the $2.
I'm giving up Lent for Lent.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So, but if you're gonna celebrate a president, I'm okay with celebrating Washington. And what a life this guy had. I mean,
yeah.
Not much is known about his early life. The whole idea of the cherry tree, notwithstanding,
A complete myth.
A complete myth.
A demonstrated myth, in fact.
Yeah. Yes. But once you get into, I think he was 20 or so, and at the beginning of the French and Indian War, I believe he fired what would come to be the first shot in the French and Indian War. That's before anything is known about this guy. He's already right in the thick of things in the 7 Years' War in Europe, the French and Indian War in the United States. How awesome is that?
He was a badass soldier. That's how he got the job as commander of the, Revolutionary Army, because he had military experience as an officer fighting for the British here in North America against the French and Indian alliance aspect of it out in the colonies. He, in many ways, the dude was totally badass. I mean, he was a quiet guy. I wouldn't describe him as an intellectual as I would say Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison. Those guys were intellectuals. But you don't have to be an intellectual to be a moral hero. What turns out to be so awesome about George Washington is the way he conducted the American Revolutionary War. Just brilliant strategy. I mean, he lost all kinds of battles and still ended up winning the war because he preserved the military, for one thing, did many courageous things in doing so. But then in a couple of really important surprise attacks on the British, he just kicked their ass because of some really smart strategy and tactics, and a little help from the French Navy at the end there that really was critical. So he handled the Revolutionary War brilliantly, but then he laid down his office. He said, one of the things that leaders normally do in the course of history, they win a war, they're the successful general, and they end up becoming the king or the monarch, the emperor. The contemporary example is, of course, Napoleon. And Napoleon did not lay down,
No.
More than that, when the Articles of Confederation weren't working out for the American colonies, there was this demand for a new constitution, and everyone realized that without his leadership, and so he presided over the Constitutional Convention. Without his leadership, it would lack credibility. He led that. He was reluctantly, kind of drafted into being president, and then after 2 terms, he said, "That's it, no more. I'm out of here." He distrusted political parties a great deal. And so the first cabinet of the United States contained the warring factions that were already beginning to develop. His Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was at the insofar as there was this polarization, the opposite end of his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. But he tried to contain the differences within his cabinet and then said, "Guess what, guys? I'm not going to be your president forever. I am out of here." He signed some of the most important legislation. For example, when Congress proposed the Bill of Rights in the first Congress, and James Madison was in the House and they proposed this Bill of Rights, George Washington was all on board. So it is his character, his moral character. He came to oppose slavery, and, they give founding fathers grief for having slaves. And to some extent, that's proper. But we have to keep that in context, of course, when slavery was ubiquitous.
Jim, just to interrupt you for a sec, I think that the proper stance there is, yes, condemn them and criticize them for owning slaves, but praise them for setting a foundation upon which slavery had to fall and for their arguments against slavery.
Wow. That Declaration of Independence thing. Thomas Jefferson wanted to put a condemnation of slavery in. The southern states, led by South Carolina, would have no part of it, and they wouldn't signed up to it. But think of what was put in. All men are created equal and have equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when slavery was fought in this country 7 years later, a fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln specifically invoked that phrase, that ideal, as the reason, the moral justification for turning a war that simply to keep the Union united into a crusade against slavery. And so if you haven't read the Gettysburg Address, the other guy, great president who was born in February, read the Gettysburg Address. And if you can't be moved by this short, powerful speech in which after the brutal battle of Gettysburg, bloody mess that Gettysburg battle was, he converted the war into a crusade against slavery. That's it. No more of this crap. If we're going to go to war with the South, we're going to make it have real consequences. That is the total end of slavery. And that led to the end of slavery in not just the United States, in many other places. People don't realize England had abolished slavery in England in the 18th century. They were pioneers in doing that, but they still had an international slave trade in their colonies. There were still British slaves in Jamaica well into the 19th century. Just several years before we had our Civil War. So if relatively liberal civilized places still had slavery well into the 1800s, we have to mark Abraham Lincoln as a superhero too. He, by the way, died for that cause. He was killed by a Confederate fanatic. And it didn't help the cause of the South at all. It was quite counterproductive, as most assassinations are. Sure. But these men, both Washington and Lincoln, literally risked their lives to make the world better. Wow. And they did.
Okay. I'm not a Lincoln fan, but I will say this, Jim. The Gettysburg Address is very moving. It's an incredible piece of just oration. And I've been now to the Gettysburg battlefield, and oh my God, just the aura of the place. There's something about history that is just very powerful. I had the same feeling at the Lexington battlefield, where it's just such a powerful thing. I used to watch this show called Reign, and it was a fictionalized story about Mary, Queen of Scots. And the Scottish, they sent it. She was over in England. I mean, in France, and they came over. The Scots came over, and they were very much opposed to her. Whoever came over, and when she took a stand to them and showed that she was the queen, and they got down on their knees and bowed to her, it's just a powerful. The imagery is very powerful.
Well, talk about someone I don't approve of. I mean,
Right.
the fact is that Scotland and France have had a traditional alliance, and they had for many generations against England. Because why? England was trying to constantly take over Scotland, and for 100 years in this famous 100 Years' War, which was actually not quite more than 100 years, but through a sustained period of battles, England was trying to conquer France, and for a sustained period of years, they were trying to take over Scotland. This made Scotland and France natural allies. Now, when Protestantism happened in the 16th century in Scotland, this made a woman who'd been raised in France and married to the French king who just died with a French mother, a suspicious character to the new Protestant nobility of Scotland. So they were going to come to loggerheads at some point, and they did. And a much more interesting character, in my view, historically, is her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, who, when the Scots kicked Mary, Queen of Scots, out of the country, basically became the prisoner, an uninvited guest of Elizabeth. What a political problem that was for her. So she tried not to execute her for 20 some years, basically. And when she did, it did stimulate the launch of the Spanish Armada. But you want to talk about a heroic, as monarchs go, I oppose monarchy, but the study of the brilliance of a monarch, I think, is much more to be found in perhaps the most successful monarch in European history, Elizabeth I of England.
And when they call her the Virgin Queen, is that with kind of a wink?
Well, at the time, she went unmarried, and her private life has been the matter of great public speculation because she did like the boys. And so she had a number of courtiers who were her favorites at different periods. Her most long-lasting one, the Earl of Leicester, really was someone she cared about deeply. Now, there's been a great deal of speculation as to what they actually were up to in their private lives, but I think that is truly an irrelevant thing. People are going to have private lives, and she used marriage. She held out the possibility to foreign princes that they might get an alliance with England if they married her. So she played this game for much of her reign until it became unrealistic because of her age, to keep the European powers that might have united against her, the Catholic powers that might have been united against her, off footing. But she did, for capitalist purposes, and this is the capitalist corner, she began the undoing of government-granted monopolies. You couldn't engage in the wine trade without a special license from the government, which gave you the monopoly in that trade. She commenced a brilliant policy of ending those government-granted monopolies, and that was a crack in the medieval ice that started opening up, at least starting to open up, a comparative free market in England, which really gathered steam in the century to follow and led to the early industrial revolution in England. But by the time a century had passed after her reign, unmistakably that policy of economic liberalization was doing great things for ordinary English people.
So back to Washington. You
mentioned, yes.
You mentioned,
I could talk history all day long.
Yeah. I think you could talk you don't have to add about history. Just I could talk all day long would suffice. So you mentioned how Washington wasn't the intellectual. What this reminds me of is when Ayn Rand says that there needed to be an alliance between philosophers and businessmen, between the intellectuals and the people that are practically implementing and applying it. So when it comes to Washington, Jefferson, Madison, yes, fantastic intellects. Alexander Hamilton, too, for all my disagreements with him. Phenomenal intellect.
Yeah.
Ben Franklin, John Adams. But none of these guys are going to do what Washington did, right? You needed somebody with Washington's moral status, his intestinal fortitude, his leadership quality. That was necessary. So we needed to have both. You needed to have the intellectuals to sort of usher in the Enlightenment ideas, But we also needed the man who, you give me an idea against a gun, the idea loses, right? Right. The idea people needed to have people willing to fight and lead, and Washington filled that role.
Absolutely. He was a man of moral character in one very important way. He was not a power luster. You and Mark have said on many occasions that the only person qualified to lead a country is the man who's not interested in leading the country,
Yeah.
a man who's not after personal power. There were people like Hamilton who even suggested that Washington become a king. And Washington, if he'd gone for that, might have created a real crisis in early America. So for his moral character and not being a power luster, even though he'd been a successful general, America owes a lot. Now, you say America was lucky. Geez, we have all these wonderful people who are called our founding fathers. And by the way, some founding mothers, too, that were really sharp people who did a lot to create America. What a lucky coincidence. No, it wasn't a lucky coincidence. They were products of their culture and their time, the Enlightenment. And the best parts of the Enlightenment, the best parts of the English and French Enlightenment, men like philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu, and their proponents, men like Voltaire, who had a powerful influence on secularizing our government. The United States Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, is a radical step forward in secular government. No attempt at religious justification for it. They were using the reason and science of the Enlightenment to construct a government on, in effect, scientific grounds. And the first rule in the Bill of Rights is no established religion. No, and within the Constitution, no religious test for office, and free exercise of religion. You get to exercise your philosophical beliefs freely without government interference. That is a radical step in the direction of secularizing world government. There were, in the colonies, for example, some modest moves in that direction before this by the American colonists, but that was institutionalized by the revolutionary minds that helped create the United States of America. And America is, I would say, all of us who don't belong to that culture and are the fortunate beneficiaries of all that, owe them a great deal of gratitude. There were people who thought otherwise at the time, but fortunately, the people who won the day were the advocates of liberty, a principled liberty that wanted to establish individual rights as the foundational limit on democracy, at least on the federal level, and then over decades it happened on the more and more on the state level, so that America is, as Ayn Rand put it, the most moral country in its conception that has ever existed. And I have to agree, because when you look at the effect of the American Revolution on other constitutions, on other revolutions, a revolution that happened shortly thereafter, the French Revolution, did not, at least immediately, work out so well for the French. You had a reign of terror, you went through Napoleon, and it really wasn't until the 1830s and 1840s that things began to really liberalize in a place like France, and only temporarily, as far as I'm concerned. But still, America, the impact of the American Revolution was like throwing a boulder in the middle of a pond, and the ripples across the world are unmistakable.
Yeah, that's something else too. That Washington keeping us out of war with England on the behalf of the French Revolutionary government, I thought was very good. You mentioned the French Revolution. There's a great quote from Will Durant, the historian. I'm not going to get the quote exact, but it refers to Rousseau, the philosopher, and he says Rousseau was everywhere leveling, and when the revolution fell into the hands of his followers, Marat and Robespierre, equality had its chance and liberty got guillotined. And I think that just really captures the essence of that.
Liberty got guillotined.
Yes.
I mean, think of it. One of the greatest French scientists who ever lived, one of the fathers of chemistry, Antoine Lavoisier, was executed. Why? Because he'd worked for the previous government and his parents were previous government officials. So let's behead one of the best heads in the whole country. And I think that, obviously it was a reign of terror where lots of people got their heads sliced off simply because of their status. Very much like the Russian Revolution if you were a bourgeoisie, if you were connected to the government, if they suspected you at all, you were expected to starve to death or get a firing squad or sent to Siberia or something.
Yeah, and the thing is once countries resort to that shit, right? In France, it wasn't like you had one team that just stayed in power beheading everybody. There were successive teams, and you went from being the beheader to the beheadee.
Beheadee.
Yeah, very, very rapidly.
Principles will come back to bad principles will come back to bite you. Good principles, if you stick to it, will keep you to the truth. Right. And it's a question of which ideas you adopt that'll really be if fraternité and égalité are up there with liberté and you don't understand the relationship between those.
Jim, say it in English now so everybody knows what we're talking about. Their famous French motto.
Yeah, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Yes. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Bastiat, by the way, Bastiat said that the two will destroy the other.
Misunderstood. Those two will two are basically collectivism, the way they understood them. That must destroy the individualism that liberté stands for.
Yes. So when Washington, before he even gets his commission to be the head of the colonial army, he actually says, look, I'll come to the aid of the colonies, give me an army and I'll sustain them by myself. I'll pay for them. He then doesn't take any money. He takes what's necessary to, keep the troops fed and do whatnot, keep them going. But he doesn't take a salary. He's just a very principled guy. There's three things that I want you to address, Jim, before we get to the next topic. There's three things that Washington did that are just absolutely monumental. One is crossing the Delaware. The other is Valley Forge. And then finally, the victory over Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown.
My God. As I said, it's an astonishing thing. What he was basically doing was spending most of his time fleeing from the British Army to keep the American Revolutionary Army intact because the British wanted to corner him. And it is true that the Americans had learned from Scottish and Irish resistance to the British Empire that, look, this organized British army was going to be impossible to beat on their own terms. If you marched out there and fought them on their own terms, you would have been mowed down. So between guerrilla tactics and George Washington, in effect, fleeing most of the time to keep the army intact, that led to moments when he could, with outstanding personal courage, and remarkable, they talk about badass, crossing the Delaware, badass moments where he was willing to personally risk himself. Look, the flight from New York City, right, when the British were taking over in New York City, says a lot to the first thing I said. But when it comes to his victories, he could see that he could now sneak up on the British and kick their ass. And when he found those moments, he would do whatever it took. He would cross a frozen Delaware River. He would, the man was a brilliant general. There's no doubt about it. And part of his success was, and those moments when America needed a victory to keep the thing going, because you can't keep fleeing and fleeing and fleeing and inspire people into doing something. What you needed were tactical moments where you really could stop the British army and have a victory, chalk a victory up on the scoreboard and say, hey, we won this one, guys. And that kept them going. Sure, you could make the colonies ungovernable, which is in effect what they did. And as the years passed on, it became more and more evident to the British, look, these colonies are unmanageable and you can't really rule from an ocean away, thousands of miles away, colonists who simply won't be ruled. But more than that, you needed victories. And Washington picked his moments. Washington had outstanding intelligence. He took advantage of that outstanding intelligence to pick his moments. And even if he had to try something really risky to do it, he would nail them. And he had some decisive victories. He had some moments where he was victorious and could mark a win on the scoreboard. And the final one, Yorktown, it did require the help of the French Navy in order to pull that off. But on the ground, he knew he had them cornered. And again, brilliant intelligence, picking the right moment, having a little coordination there, and his astonishing personal courage. I mean, badass is understating the way George Washington managed that war. And then when the war was over, he said, I retire. I don't want to be your warlord. I don't want to be your king. Let me please just go back to being a farmer in Virginia. And the ideas of the revolution got to him at the end, so that by the time his life ended, he freed his slaves. I mean, this man, morally speaking, can only be regarded in the context of his times as a hero of the highest order. I don't judge people by contemporary standards. You know, did he ever have slaves? Was he a slave owner for most of his life until the end? Okay, I understand all that. In his context, he was a tremendously moral man of high character. And it was that character, you know, that's why he became known as the father of the country. That's why everyone, whatever their political parties as the rest of American history played out, would look back to George Washington with veneration. Here was a man who was a brilliant general, a courageous man, personally brave man, but a man who was not a power luster, a man who wanted his country to get off to a sound footing without some kind of political warlord or military warlord taking over, which is so often the result of other revolutions.
Great man indeed. So there was an article today from the Independent Institute by Philip Magnus, who I've interviewed on my own show. I've had him on this show to discuss about this very topic that we're going to address today. But I think it's worthy of discussion for a lot of reasons. And it's called The Post-Liberal War on Economics. And he talks about these post-liberals who basically are social conservatives and, I don't know, economic state capitalists, economic socialists. I don't know how to even phrase it, but they're certainly not for capitalism.
Enlightenment liberalism, the very thing that created America, represented not just economic liberalization, which, by the way, was perhaps the best thing to materially happen to humanity in the course of human history. I mean, people don't realize the Industrial Revolution of the last 300 years or so. You look at the human population and sort of the flat curve. I mean, there are little moments when the human population goes up before the Industrial Revolution, but the human population takes a steep hockey stick curve up, starting with the Industrial Revolution. Infant mortality goes down, life expectancy increases, along with all kinds of other quality of life improvements. So, and that economic liberalization went with a liberalization that would create the ideals that would end slavery, that would liberate women from legal systems that were incredibly oppressive. Under traditional English law, women had no rights to their own children. The property, in effect, was turned over to their husband. They didn't have property rights. They didn't have rights to their own children. Forget the right, to vote, which would happen in the early 20th century, both in America and in Great Britain. But under traditional English law, women had zero rights. What is going to bring an end to slavery? What is going to get people to question racism? What's going to bring legal rights to women? It is the ideas of the liberal Enlightenment. Also, this was a pro-science movement. It was a movement for reason and individualism, which liberated the mind so that people could question everything of the past. So what we have here is in the anti-liberal, and this is what this is, this new conservative. We were talking the other day again about fusionism. We were talking about how early conservatives in the middle of the 20th century, men like Frank Meyer, were trying to combine things that really were illogically inconsistent. They could not be combined consistently or logically. Social conservatism with free market economics. That is an impossible combination. What we're seeing now is the abandonment of any attempt to fuse that. No, We're going to be anti-capitalist, in effect, in our economic policy, and we're going to be medieval in our, and tribalist, even racist in our social policy. So, in effect, what some of these people like Deneen represent is anti-liberalism.
Yeah.
They can call it post-liberalism, they can call it whatever they want, but they're against liberal. For decades now, I've been trying to reclaim the word liberal from these leftists who have anti-capitalist economic policies. But I'll tell you something. I now, in the face of these people, really want us to reclaim the word liberal, because if traditionally in the 20th century the left represented an opposition to the free market, and the right represented an opposition to personal moral freedom. They wanted abortion laws, school prayer laws, to promote religious values and so forth. So one side wanted to regulate your spirit. The other side wanted to regulate your body, the material conditions of the world. It was a kind of mind-body dichotomy, as Ayn Rand recognized. Well, that is really becoming less and less tenable. And so you see both on the left and the right this movement to abandon the very things that they once sort of stood for, or at least nominally stood for. So the left is now calling for censorship, and the right is now calling for more aggressive economic intervention. And when we're headed toward that, we get philosophers like these new anti-liberals like Deneen, who are much more consistent. That's right. Economic controls go with social controls. And so what we want to do is we want to keep foreigners out, and we want to have social conservative policies along with more economic controls. And believe me, those two are much more consistently aligned. But look at what they're advocating. They're advocating for the medieval system. They really want to go back to some kind of theocracy, a command economy, moral controls, ripping people's tongues out so they can't think and speak freely. And what we're seeing is a frightening thing when J.D. Vance, the current vice president, has...
We're going to get to that. Don't go too deep.
But look, we are seeing a frightening change in everything that was good about the American Revolution, everything that was good about the Enlightenment, everything that was good in the century that followed the American Revolution in terms of extending freedom and rights to people, and this explosive industrial revolution that would change the material conditions of the world, as well as freedom of thought across the civilized world. We're now seeing the overt, consistent opposition to the greatest thing that ever happened in human history. The Industrial Revolution, the liberalism that made that possible.
So this Patrick Deneen, now I read one of his books when I was incarcerated, and I immediately started to see the errors that he was making in his claims about what classical liberalism was. He was conflating continental liberalism with classical liberalism. So he, in 2007, in something called peak oil, he makes a prediction that basically civilization is going to collapse in months because we're running out of oil.
Why did anyone ever take him seriously after
I don't
that?
know. But
I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. So he, basically, I guess the idea was that this whole liberal experiment has been propped up by oil. We're going to run out, and you're going to find out not so much that it's not as good as you thought. Now, that, of course, didn't happen. And what he did was just use the same rhetoric toward other things, but drop the peak oil. I've posted the article, by the way, by Philip Magnus to both X and Facebook.
It's a great article.
So post-liberalism, according
heroic
to...
work in fighting this.
Oh, he's awesome. Yeah, Phil Magnus is great. So post-liberalism is a broad intellectual movement that argues the dominant form of modern Western liberalism, especially as developed in the late 20th century, has failed and should be replaced or fundamentally restructured. It's a criticism of the thinkers like John Locke. It's a criticism of the tradition that emphasizes individual rights, neutral government, free markets, freedom of speech. So these folks argue that it leads to extreme individualism, weak families, cultural fragmentation, and they want to, have the government intervene in the economy through, for instance, tariffs to protect these things. it's not lost on me that we've heard Tucker Carlson come out and criticize libertarian economics. It's also not
Embrace
lost
Muslim
on me.
culture. The most medieval. I mean, he thinks Qatar is great because they don't have gay pride parades there, so he bought property there.
Yes.
I mean, in effect, that's what he's saying. To talk
Yes.
about the personification of this hatred of individual liberty across the board, which is now being embraced by the right. Yeah.
Well, and there's something interesting because it doesn't seem that he did it intentionally or that he's been influenced. And I don't think he's a reader, so I really don't think he has.
I can't say that he knows the
but
need.
Trump's rhetoric and policies meshes well with this stuff. His populism, his tariffs, his immigration restrictions, his interjections into the economy, whether it be in the housing market or banning who can buy houses or direct payments to citizens, are all right in line. His touting the Bible, constantly, and it meshes well with this stuff.
Well, there's no empirical scientific justification for anything that comes spouts out of this guy's mouth. He doesn't know history. He doesn't know economics. He isn't really explaining anything. His predictions, as we just pointed out, turn out to be factually false. What he's doing is giving voice to, I think, a rising movement on the right anyway, a perception, a populist perception on the part of people who've been conditioned, slowly over decades, mind you, to think capitalism has failed, individual freedom has failed. And so they don't need to. I don't believe in a coordinated conspiracy any more than I believe that it was merely coincidence that the founding fathers all had similarly good ideas all at the same time in the same moment and had political influence. No. These things, they're conditioned by deeper philosophical things. The post-Enlightenment thinkers began to abandon reason in a very aggressive way. When you abandon reason, you're setting yourself up for this kind of irrational populism. And there's reasons why Trump's policies are, not exactly, I think, maybe what Deneen all wants. But like I say, what's really scary is when you have politicians like J.D. Vance who do seem to know and approve of and read that kind of material. Then what you're getting is not just a pragmatist who's trying to appeal to, a populism in a population that has been badly conditioned against reason and individualism into an explicit philosophy that J.D. Vance in that sense is far more dangerous than a seat-of-the-pants populist pragmatist like Trump. He would consistently be anti-liberal, both in his economic and social policy.
Right, because what we have here, it's almost like you have a perfect storm for this stuff. You have a lot of people who feel marginalized. They've been called, it's interesting because I just saw a thing with Obama talking about how divisive Trump is. Now, for those of us who remember Obama's presidency, he wasn't exactly the kumbaya guy himself, right? They're clinging to their guns and their Bibles. You didn't build that. We need to spread the wealth around. And there was a lot of other stuff. So you have people who, for generations, for decades really, have been called racist because they voted Republican. Biden said of Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, they're going to put y'all back in chains, when speaking to a black audience. So you've had this going on for quite some time. You want to push grandma off the cliff. So you do have your run-of-the-mill sort of people who feel marginalized and angry toward the left. But J.D. Vance is not that. J.D. Vance is the intellectual version of this. Friend of Patrick Deneen, and Patrick Deneen is his intellectual mentor. So what it seems to me you have is J.D. Vance, who, by the way, is no dummy, sees in the Trump movement the parallels to what his philosophy is. He's now latched onto that, and I believe wants to take it in a even more dangerous direction than Trump. And we can see that with the influencers, heritage Americans and things of that nature, going right back to Vance's speech at the Republican convention where he talked about, basically blood and soil, if he didn't use those words exactly.
He said, America is not an idea. He said, America is a land and a people. So if you want an echo of blood and soil ideology, and that I found horrific. I mean, absolutely horrific. He said, people don't die for ideas. They die for their families. They die for their homes. No, I would only risk my life for an idea. My immediate response is no. In fact, to defend my family, to defend my home, I would have to be promoting an idea. And if an army defending my liberty and my family and my property were marching across my property, I'd let them do it in a heartbeat. Okay, I understand the hierarchical priority here in a way that Vance does not. He's an emotionalist. What really is remarkable about Deneen, as I say, it's not rational. It's not some kind of rationally integrated philosophy that'll give you good scientific economics or sound political philosophy. These people are emotionalist populists who look at, I mean, and the only way to really have goodwill among human beings is to set them free. It is only chosen relationships that can be really the real relationships, benevolent relationships. There's a direct connection, as Ayn Rand said, between social benevolence and individual liberty. And if you attempt to foist it on people, you're going to achieve precisely the opposite, polarization, an ugly resentment of the other side. And when we see today this increasing polarization, an increasingly nasty polarization, it is the direct result not of liberty, Mr. Deneen, but of increasingly illiberal policies. You know, and my God, you know, for all their problems, you know, Goldwater and Reagan and so forth, you know, at least the Republicans of yore were, you know, saying Hayek is my hero, or appointing a friend of Ayn Rand to be their chief economic advisor, or people on the Goldwater committee listening to Ayn Rand's friends or Ayn Rand herself. I mean, they had huge problems. They did by no means deploy Ayn Rand's philosophy. On the other hand, give me the folks of the give me the peace, love, and understanding hippies of the 1960s and 70s over any of the creatures on both the left and the right today. And what's really frightening, as I say, is there's this fascist convergence that seems to be taking place. And nothing could embody that more than Deneen and Vance. They've thoroughly thrown in the true ideals of the American Revolution. Everything that Vance and Deneen stand for is everything opposite of what made America great in its founding and why it set America off on such a good start to change the way of life, and not only in North America, but across the world. And so the most virulently anti-American ideas are being promoted as the patriotic American, tribalist, nationalist ideals among Republican circles today. Tucker Carlson, Deneen, J.D. Vance. Nothing could be less American in terms of the ideals that our founding fathers stood for. And you can hear in the Gettysburg Address. Do you want to know the opposite of that? Listen to Deneen. Yeah. Okay. And he promotes it as a kind of Americanism, American populism. No, you're going to pull your legal guns out, both economically and socially, and make human benevolence impossible. Social cohesion will break down. We will have more and more violence, tribalism, resentment. That is the path. That kind of populism is the path towards a French Revolution, not an American Revolution. Or still worse, a Soviet Revolution or a Nazi takeover of Weimar Germany. That's what's really in the cards. But you see it on the left too. They have abandoned whatever devotion to free speech that they had once upon a time. They're calling for overt censorship. They despise the U.S. Constitution. Overtly. So both sides are now moving in this anti-American fascist direction. And they're all going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this year, 2026. And none of them will have any appreciation for what made America's founding so moral and great, and the huge improvement in human life that it resulted in. So the greatest thing that ever happened to America was the Enlightenment and liberalism, Mr. Deneen and Mr. J.D. Vance. That was the greatest thing that ever happened in human history. And we have failed to appreciate what the philosophical roots of that and what made that possible. And if we're having problems today, it's because we've been decade by decade for more than a century moving in our own policies here in the United States away from that. And all the problems, insofar as they do identify problems, are the direct result of that, not the result of human liberty and individual rights and a respect for reason. No, they've misidentified any the real problem. If you want social cohesion, we need religion, the rejection of reason. If you want social cohesion, we need more government laws, economic interventionist law. No, you're moving in the opposite direction. You're moving towards the Dark Ages.
So, Jim, you mentioned the Enlightenment, and before you mentioned the sort of the chain. And with the Enlightenment came what, well, at least I think many people think of as Counter-Enlightenment thinkers. Hume, Kant, Rousseau. You have Hume, who, of course, basically says induction is possible, that you can't reason for figure out cause and effect. He said there can be no morality. Kant severs the mind from reality altogether, basically says we're reasoning about, this phenomenal world. Rousseau is an emotionalist, very big collectivist. And it seems that all of these have impacted or influenced this anti-liberal thinker, Deneen, and the people around them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The anti-Enlightenment, the counter-Enlightenment is what these people are all about. And by the way, there's something to be said. Hume sort of undermined human confidence in the power of reason, just as the scientific revolution was, gaining real steam. And think of all that the scientific revolution has given us in terms of medical treatments, new technologies, changing our way of life, our ability to communicate and travel. All of that is the result of reason, obviously, and the freedom that liberated the human mind and liberated people in order to act on it. What Hume did is he comes along and undermines, in the middle of all that, everyone's confidence in reason. And, by the way, really attacks the idea of an objective morality. You're absolutely right. But in this sense, Kant is worse. He's worse than both Hume and Rousseau, although Hume and Rousseau were big influences on Kant directly. But Kant created this entire philosophical system that combined all of the very worst things you could possibly imagine. In his epistemology, we cannot access reality. So he's a radical subjectivist when it comes to his epistemology. In ethics, he's a radical intrinsicist. Regardless of consequences, do your duty. Now, this set off an intellectual chain reaction of intellectuals in Europe and in America that were starting to undermine on an ideological basis everything good that was happening in the world around them. Everything. And so you ask Lenin, where are your philosophical foundations for your Marxism? And he will point you to Immanuel Kant. No, I mean, that's just that. If a German philosopher that has such a powerful influence on, creeps like Hegel and Marx, and you do your duty regardless of consequences. That is a Holocaust waiting to happen. German Nazis were doing their duty regardless of consequences, just obeying orders because it was good for our collective, the race, the Aryan race, for the nation, for the Volk. Okay, so they're doing their duty for the collective regardless of consequences. And guess what you're going to have? Oceans of spilt blood. So the Marxism and Nazism, in fact, the totalitarianism of the 20th century, is a direct result of these counter-Enlightenment philosophers. And if you want demonstration of this, please read the first book by my great teacher, friend, and mentor, Leonard Peikoff, The Ominous Parallels. And you will have demonstrated to you the impact of exactly what happened here with Immanuel Kant in particular, and all of the post-mini-Kantians that happened afterwards. So if all the Hegels and Marxes helped create totalitarianism in the 20th century, they were made possible by this dude, Immanuel Kant. And it was Hume who awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumbers, as he put it. No, philosophy is what shapes history. It is the scientific revolution. It was the, pro-Aristotelian move of the Renaissance and in the age of science that really made possible the discovery of rights and the creation of the United States and the scientific revolution and the industrial revolutions that followed. And it was the ideas of these truly despicable men, in my view. Kant, I mean, you think what a mild-mannered little German philosopher who only wrote books and didn't want much to do with things. And in some ways, his politics, leave aside his politics, what he's doing is he's undermining the human mind and trying to condition people into doing their moral duty regardless of consequences, separating value from life itself. Now, when you do something like what Immanuel Kant does, is it surprising that you're going to get socialists like Fichte, proto-totalitarians like Hegel, Marxists that come after Hegel and are directly influenced by him, et cetera, who are going to have a direct influence on all the totalitarian evils? Was it a coincidence that the 20th century saw a rise in the power of centralized government? I mean, Stalin, Hitler, shortly after Mao, that's just all coincidentally happening around the world in governments, or even in the more liberal places like the United States and Great Britain. We got the New Deal, and by the 50s, Great Britain would have democratic socialism. Even there, they were being influenced by these collectivist rotten ideas. And again, it's no consequence that those dudes were contemporaries any more than it was a coincidence that the founding fathers were contemporaries. You go back to look at the year 1500 or something. People like Columbus, Copernicus, Da Vinci are all contemporaries. Is that just a coincidence of history? No, these are not coincidences. The dominant philosophy in any given era will shape that philosophy. It's art, it's science, it's politics. And so, they say in law enforcement, there are no coincidences. Well, in history, there are no coincidences. When you have all the great minds and explorers and achievers in the Renaissance all happening at once, it ain't no coincidence, friends. When you have the founding fathers rising to power in the founding of America, it ain't no coincidence. When you see totalitarianism and socialism taking over in the 20th century, it is not a coincidence. It's the result of the power of philosophy, of ideas.
Well said. So, okay, quick housekeeping. I will not be here tomorrow, so there won't be a show either here or for Everyday Ethics, but I will be back Wednesday to provide you with excellent content. The capitalist thought of the day is this: we do not need post-liberalism, and we do not need anti-liberalism. We sure as hell don't need government intervention in the economy or government intervention to protect hold our families together. What we need is a return to classical liberalism, buttressed with a philosophy that provides it with a sound base. In other words, what we need is the classical liberalism of the founding fathers, supported by objectivism. We need to promote real capitalism, real freedom of the human mind, the human spirit, and the human body. Only then will we be able to flourish as human beings are capable of doing. Now, my question, everybody go to YouTube and answer it. Who is your favorite founding father? Everyone go to YouTube, please, and answer that question. Jim, tell them where they can find you.
You can find me on The Rational Egoist. You have a really good podcast there going on, my brother. You can sometimes find me here when Mark FTA's on you, fails to appear on you. And
he's an actor or something. I don't know.
He's claiming. I don't know. He makes movies or some such. Yeah. Anyway, but you can also find me at the Ayn Rand Center, United Kingdom, where I do all kinds of material for them, both for members only, but regular podcasts for them when they do their public podcasts. And you can find me at Facebook. I'm answering questions there almost every day, so hit me up, James Stevens Valiant.
Jim, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much. Please join us today, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, for Everyday Ethics right here on this channel. Until Wednesday, so you got 47 hours now. Remember, check your premises.